leaders have quality data and research to make decisions that help our communities thrive. We are a nonpartisan organization. We have our board of directors is made up of Democrats, Republicans, and independents. We focus on tax and budget policy, education, finance as well. And we're starting to do a little work in the healthcare space. So today we are going to talk about the budget. The Appropriations Committee has put out their preliminary budget, so we're going to highlight some of the big things in the budget and how it differs a little bit from the governor's. We're going to talk about some highlights as it relates to tax policy discussions that are going on in the legislature. We are also going to talk about whether we're going to see tax reform this session or possibly next session. And we're going to talk a little bit about the federal COVID relief package that the federal COVID relief package that the House is taking up this week, and then it will go to the Senate. So for those of you who have watched our presentations before, you know that when we're talking about the budget or we're talking about taxes, we always show this chart. And this chart shows our general fund appropriations. This is for FY22, which is the next fiscal year or the first year in the next biennium. You can see here that we are projected to appropriate, or at least according to the preliminary report, we would be appropriating 4.721 billion. The reason why we think it's really important to show this slide anytime we have a presentation is because how we spend our money is tied to how we raise our funding, right? Those two are really connected. So so when we're talking about taxes, we want to make sure we also are understanding where that money goes. So you'll see here, much as in years past, 45% of our general fund appropriations budget is going to education, 36% is going to health and human services, and then 12% goes to public safety and law enforcement. So 93% of our general fund budget go to education, health and human services, and public safety or law enforcement. I do think it's also important we highlight the general fund appropriations, because when the legislature doesn't have enough revenue to fund state government, they're going to make cuts or reduce expenses on our general fund appropriations, because this is the most discretionary part of our budget. So this is what I think I really want to highlight the next couple of slides as it relates to our budget, our preliminary budget. You can see here that our appropriations are likely to decline below Great Recession levels as a share of the economy. So our personal income has actually been going up and really hasn't stagnated during the pandemic. But as we're going to talk, our general fund appropriations for the next biennium are projected, at least if we stick with the preliminary budget, are going to be relatively flat. So as a result, as our personal income is going up and our appropriations are going flat, we see that our appropriations as a share of personal income are going down. And you can see here that we started in FY99, where 48 per $1,000 of personal income would go to our general fund appropriations budget. Now we're at about $38. And where this is most pronounced is in K-12 education, which is that top line. You can see here at the beginning of the chart, we started at just below $16 per $1,000 of personal income, and we're ending up just a little bit above $10. So our funding for K-12 has been declining quite a bit, and of course that impacts how much we're paying in property taxes toward K-12 education. Then higher ed is the next, that's a dark blue. You can see how that has been declining over time, again, starting just below 10 and ending up just above $6 per $1,000 of personal income. And then the green line is health and human services. You can see that's gone up and it's coming back down. And Medicaid has kind of gone up and down and went up quite a bit in anticipation of Medicaid expansion and would decline under this budget. And then public safety and law enforcement has gone up in the last few years. Hannah, do you have a question?
I just have a quick, so we can see both the, your slide and like the notes section. It isn't in presentation mode, so I think it might be kind of hard for people to see the graphics.
Okay.
Don't know how to fix it.
Yeah. Okay, so let's see. Nope.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you, but I also think it might be a little bit hard. I don't know if it might be.
I don't know what to do there.
Okay. We can also share the slides after too, if that's helpful, but I just wanted you to know.
Let's see if I leave. No, I don't want to leave. Let's see. I'm going to stop sharing.
Okay.
And I'm not exactly sure.
It might be when you share your screen to share the presentation, if that's an option, instead of a screen. That might help. I don't know if that will help. But people are saying they can, someone said, thanks for everyone helping.
Is that better?
I think it says, someone said you need to be in single screen mode. I don't know what that means. Let's see. I think that's what I usually do. Is just hit that button, yeah.
I don't know why it's not working.
Me neither. Well, everyone said they can see the graphics okay. So if you
okay.
want to like that, that's fine. I just wanted to make sure you knew that everything was showing up.
Okay, well, and now I can't go back to slideshow. It's not letting me. Technology.
It's not our friend.
All right.
Okay, clearly I'm the one who messed it up. Everyone said the correct. No. Okay, we got screen sharing again.
I can't get it into. Okay, that's the best I can do.
Yep.
All right. Sorry about that.
Sorry, everyone. I'll just go back to hiding that.
Here, wait, I can do that. But in any case, okay. All right. Okay, so let me just go back and recap a little bit. So essentially what we're seeing in this budget, and there's been a lot of conversation about, our revenue is doing a lot better than we expected that it would. And so that's certainly a good thing, but still, because our budget is for the next biennium right now anyway, is projected to be relatively flat, but our income is going up, we are seeing these declines in our general fund appropriations. And again, that top one, K-12 education, that has a direct relationship then with property taxes. So in terms of the governor's priorities, so he proposes spending $1.148 billion on property tax relief through the next biennium. And we're going to dig into that a little bit more. And then he would limit property tax growth to 3%, and we'll talk about that as well. And then he would pass LB 387 to exempt 100% of military retirement pay for eligible veterans. He would appropriate $20 million a year for rural broadband in LB 388. He also has in his budget $2 million a year for LB 364, which is the Opportunity Scholarship Tax Credit Act, which we'll touch base about. And then he also had $217.5 million for a new prison through FY25. Okay, so LB 1107. We're just going to revisit LB 1107 from last session for a minute. And what that did is, as you probably recall, it was a tax incentive program, and then also it would appropriate in the future $300 million for the UNMC Next project. But I want to talk about the refundable income tax credit against school property taxes paid. That was intended to be a $125 million credit for the first 4 years with some growth opportunities. And then once we hit year 5, that property tax credit was supposed to go to $375 million. And then from there grow by statewide valuation growth capped at 5% each year thereafter. So that growth opportunity was that if revenue growth exceeds 3.5%, if there's $500 million in the cash reserve, then 100% of excess revenue above that 3.5% would go into the property tax, this 1107 credit fund. If there's less than 500 million, then half of that would go into the property tax credit. So what the governor is proposing, well, and just a little bit more about this 1107 credit. So when the income tax filing deadline was moved from last April into July of last year, it moved it from last fiscal year into the current fiscal year. And because it moved it from last fiscal year to this fiscal year, it created this swing of, I think it was 280 million a year. So a swing of $560 million that went into this fiscal year. And so this was triggering an increase in the refundable 1107 refundable credit to 212 million. The governor is proposing transferring an additional 88 million to the cash reserve to, as I said before, if the cash reserve is at 500 million or above, anything over the 3.5% revenue growth would go into this 1107 credit. So he's proposing moving $88 million this fiscal year into the cash reserve fund to get the cash reserve to 500 million. This would set off an additional trigger, taking the 1107 credit to 298 million in each year of the biennium. He would then make withdrawals from the cash reserve, taking it to 335 million by FY25. So what his proposal would have done or would do is to break both the fiscal guardrails that senators had agreed upon when they debated LB 1107. That was ensuring that at least 500 million would be in the cash reserve before we accelerated that credit, and that there's at least 3.5% revenue growth to support state services. Now, again, as I said, the movement of that income tax filing deadline artificially increased the amount of revenue that it looks like we have in this fiscal year.
Yeah, a couple questions really quick.
Yes.
Where is he moving the 88 million from?
So right now, and we're going to get to it in just a second, we are above projections right now. And so what he's proposing to do is essentially what typically would happen is that any revenue that comes in the fiscal year, it's transferred the following year. So we wait until that year end to see exactly where we're at, and that balance goes into the cash reserve. So he's proposing to take just excess revenue and moving it into the cash reserve before the end of this fiscal year to get to that $500 million amount.
Okay, and is the CRF also known as the rainy day fund?
It is, yes, absolutely. Good question.
Those are our two questions right now.
Great. So in terms of the Appropriations Committee's preliminary budget then, as I said, their budget is relatively flat. We have negative 1.3% growth in FY22, which is the first year of the biennium, and then 2.5% in FY23. So an average of 0.6% growth over the biennium. So again, if you think about 1107, and the idea was we wanted to make sure we had at least 3.5% revenue growth for state spending, but we're only increasing state spending an average of 0.6% over the biennium. So again, that change in the income tax filing deadline is really inflating what our revenue looks like in this current fiscal year. They do take a $170 million shortfall that was projected when the Tax Rate Review Committee met in winter, and turns that into a $48.9 million surplus above the minimum reserve. So that money would be available for the floor if they maintain the preliminary budget when they put that out onto the floor. The reason is because of lower TIOSA. This is our K-12 funding, and valuations were up, particularly in urban areas. And so that means that there was more property tax revenue to fund TIOSA, so our state obligations went down. Neither proposal funded provider rate increases. There is a higher FMAP, which is the federal match for Medicaid, which is going to help bring more federal revenue into the state. And then there's lower funding for university salaries and health insurance increases. There were also lapsed funds and reduced appropriations that were replaced with, now in this case, CARES relief funds, or coronavirus relief funds. So I apologize, 2 different CRFs. So there were funds from prior stimulus that were used to replace some state revenue, which freed up state dollars, and then some cash fund transfers. They haven't yet funded any of the governor's priorities, and they didn't fund the increase in the Medicaid provider rates, as I mentioned. What they did instead was they set aside $130 million each year of the biennium for what they called post-hearing adjustments. In the preliminary report, they talked about wanting to go through the hearings to hear all of the agency requests and hear from all the bills before they decided which of the governor's priorities they would fund. And so again, they set aside this $130 million each year of the biennium for post-hearing adjustments. So revenue this year is $62 million above the October forecast. In the preliminary budget report, it says, however, how the last 3-month revenue performance translates into the final months and into the next 2 fiscal years is unknown. However, we would not be at all surprised if the revenue forecast is revised upward. Forecast board does meet on Friday and then again in late April. If you look at the general fund financial status, you are going to see a huge surplus in the out years. And the reason for that is because the following biennium revenue growth is projected at 6.8%. But again, the preliminary budget notes that this is substantially higher than the unofficial estimates prepared by Legislative Fiscal Office and Department of Revenue, which is why you see this huge surplus for the out years. Again, we wouldn't be surprised to see that the forecast would be revised up for the current fiscal year, but that this would be, the out year surplus would be tempered when the forecasting board meets. The cash reserve balance is projected at $446 million, and then the committee budget does use $50 million for the U.S. Spacecom project and $115 million for correctional facilities. Again, they haven't been willing to yet say we're going to pay for a prison, but they're setting that money aside to be determined later how that would be spent. In terms of the cash reserve, again, when we go into a recession, we should have 16% of our general fund receipts in that cash reserve, in that rainy day fund. And you can see here that both the governor's budget and the appropriations budget depart from an ideal balance. I know Senator Stinner would like to have at least $500 million, if not more, in that cash reserve balance. And so I think there probably will be more dialogue about whether some of the post-hearing adjustments are putting more money into the cash reserve. So any questions? Hannah, were there any more questions on the budget before we go on to some of the tax highlights?
I think we're good.
Okay, great. All right, so in terms of the main tax discussions in 2021, we're seeing efforts to limit local government spending growth, and we'll talk about that in a little more detail. There were lots and lots of new tax credits and exemptions that were introduced this year. And in appropriations too, there were lots and lots of bills. There seemed to be a lot of pent up demand. For the last few years, senators were encouraged not to bring bills with fiscal notes. So lots of bills with fiscal notes this year, both in revenue and in appropriations committees. And then there's a still outstanding question about major tax reform. There was a lot of discussion about major tax reform that was going to be introduced, and we heard this before session. And we'll talk a little bit more about what we think is going to happen here. So as I said, focus on limiting government spending or property tax growth. LB 408 and LR 22CA have been introduced, and they limit property taxes raised by local governments to 3% over the prior year. LR 22CA, of course, would be in the Constitution. So if the legislature would pass it, it would go to the vote of the people and would be very difficult to remove. LB 408 does the same thing, but is statutory. And this would apply to schools, cities, counties, community colleges, NRDs, and so forth. And I'm going to walk through, just briefly give you an example of why it could limit spending growth to well below 3%. There is an exclusion. Bonds are not counted. Any revenue needed to pay for voter approved bonds is not included in this limit, nor is growth due to new construction or annexation. That would be excluded from this cap as well. And local governments could exceed the cap by going to a vote of the people. But when we've heard these proposals been talked about from people who support them, but also people who oppose them, oftentimes it's talked about capping spending growth. And we're gonna limit spending growth for these local governments, or limit property tax growth, or limit budgets, for example. So I just want to give you an example of how it actually could limit spending growth to well below 3%. And this is an example from Millard Public Schools. If you look at FY16-17, so FY17 to FY18, they had a 12% increase in property tax revenue. But because of the way that the TIOSA formula works, they had an 11.2% decrease in state revenue. And so they actually had a decrease of 1.5% in total revenue. If LR22CA or LB408 had been in place, their property tax asking would be limited to 3% growth. Now, even in some cases, Millard is a prime example, they may not have room. If you have to have room under your levy limit to be able to increase to 3%, right? Now, in this case, Millard, in this particular year, they did have the ability to do that, but we've looked at other examples where school districts are at their levy limit, and so they actually could not they could not increase their property tax revenue 3%. But in this case, we look and say, okay, they're going to be limited to 3% increase in property tax revenue. They're still going to see an 11.2% decrease in state revenue. So Millard Public Schools, if this provision had been in place, would have seen a decrease of 5% in total revenue. So we've run a number of examples here, and you can see whether it's community colleges or schools or cities or counties, there's a really disparate impact from local government to local government in terms of how they will be impacted. Some could see spending growth above 3% depending on their mix of revenue, and some will see declines. Hannah, was there a question?
Yeah, I think you're partially answering right now, but I just wanted to make sure this person got it fully answered. What is the position of local shareholders, cities, counties, schools, colleges on capping revenue growth to 3%?
What was the beginning of that question?
What is the position of local shareholders on capping revenue growth to 3%?
Yeah, most of the political subdivisions came out and opposed those bills. I think that's the question. Because they would see significant amount of revenue loss. Here's another example, Cass County, and we have a city of Omaha. So again, Cass County had a 19.2% increase in property tax revenue from FY17 to 18, but only a 0.6% increase in other revenues. So they did see an increase in 11.4% in total revenue. If this had been in place, they would have lost 2.1 million in revenue in this single year. Here's an example of city of Omaha. So again, their property tax revenue increased 5.5%, but they only had a 0.4% increase in total revenue. And if LR22CA for LB408 had been in place, they actually would have had a decrease of 0.1% in total revenue, or $4.4 million. So all the local governments, I think, are all opposed to this. It really ties their hands and limits the ability of their local elected officials who are voted, by a vote of the people, right? And really tie their hands to respond to whatever's happening in their community. One thing that we've noticed as we've been digging into these numbers a lot, so you see Cass County, for example, had an 11.4% increase in total revenue, but I can't remember, it was either the year before it or the year after it where they had a pretty significant decline. So these local government budgets don't go like this. They're not just steady. They're kind of up and down, depending on when a local government wants to make a big purchase or has some kind of need. And so you do see a lot of ups and downs. So what this will do is it'll make sure that local governments always levy up to that full 3%. It also means that if they have other revenue that they can rely on, like fees or fines, which tend to be more regressive, they may shift to other sources of revenue. And certainly for cities, if they're not fully maximizing their local option sales tax, we would expect them to do that. So you would see sales taxes go up, which of course would be more regressive. So in terms of other notable tax bills, LB 422 expands the sales tax base to all services, but not goods that aren't currently taxed, and reduces the rate to 5%. Oh, this is old. The hearing was not this morning, sorry. It was a couple of weeks ago. So this is something, basically what Senator Breezy said was, we're just gonna say we're gonna tax all services and we're gonna delay the implementation date, and people can come in next year and make their case for why their particular service should be exempt. So he's really trying to broaden the sales tax base, but then also lower the rate accordingly. LB 680 reduces the corporate income tax rate, and this hearing is next week. LB 318 increases the earned income tax credit. This, my understanding was that this was IPP'd or killed in revenue exec session last week. The reason why I wanted to talk about the three of these together is because we think that they're all sort of components of maybe this tax reform plan that may unfold yet this session. So I'm just gonna set those aside for right now, but wanna lift that up. LB 133 or LR 11CA is Senator Erdman's consumption tax bill. It would eliminate all taxation, income taxes, sales taxes, everything, property taxes, and would create a consumption tax, which would be a singular tax. He set the rate at, I think, 12 or 13%, and the Legislative Fiscal Office found that he would still have a significant shortfall. Hannah.
Yes, this was just a second ago, but is the 3% limit based on a projection, and what do they do with the extra revenue if it exceeds 3%?
Okay, so so ask it one more time.
Yep. Is the 3% limit based on a projection, and what do they do with the extra revenue if it exceeds 3%?
Oh, I see. Okay, so essentially what would happen, and this is a really good question, is basically the way it would work is that we would take statewide revenue or statewide property tax growth. So if statewide property tax growth, let me make sure I'm explaining this correctly. No, I'm getting this confused with another bill. I'm sorry. So basically what would happen is your local government could only increase their property tax revenue 3%. So there wouldn't be any excess. They would be capped at that 3%. Now, if they, for example, I think we looked at Metro Community College, for example, had in some years had been levying less than 3% growth. They would levy up to that 3%, and then they could put it in their cash reserve, or they could lower tuition or whatever they might want to do with that. But essentially, any local government would be limited to 3% growth. So they could not levy more. They could use their valuation, but again, they could not take in any more than 3% in property taxes over the prior year, with the exception of any sort of construction growth or that would be allowed under this growth exception, or revenue needed for bonds, or another in the exception is for annexation. So you could levy up to 3% if you have the ability under your levy limit. And if you don't need all that revenue, you can stick it in a cash reserve, or you can lower some other tax, but you can't exceed 3% on the property tax side. But you might be able to levy up other taxes to recoup some of that lost revenue. So hopefully that answered the question, not very artfully. So in terms of other notable tax bills, LB 64 and LB 237 phase out Social Security taxes, although LB 237 does limit the benefits, so those above 95,000 don't receive a tax cut. LB 387, I mentioned before, exempts 100% of military retirement from taxation. LB 364 is a bill that Senator Lanahan brings every year, which is 100% tax credit for donations to private K-12 scholarship granting organizations. So this would be 14.5% more lucrative than donations to other sort of charitable organizations. All right. So any questions before we move on to what we're hearing or what we think is going to happen with tax reform? No? All right. So as I mentioned before session, we were hearing a lot about tax reform this session, and we didn't see a comprehensive bill that was introduced. And just a reminder, as I talked about LB 1107 before, LB 1107 is expected to cost $4.6 billion over the next 11 years with just a little bit of pay for. So property tax relief, when combined with the property tax credit program, is expected to make up 12.8% of the general fund appropriations in FY24. So what we had heard it was going to entail was to cut the top personal income tax rate, cut the corporate income tax, stop state taxation of international income, broaden the sales tax base, likely including groceries, and then reduce the property tax burden with a cap on local spending growth for schools, cities, counties, which is what we saw. So what we've seen is the personal income tax cut. There is a shell bill that has X's for personal income taxes. As I mentioned, there is a bill that would reduce the corporate income tax. There is a bill that changes how we tax international income. We do have Senator Breezy's bill that would broaden the sales tax base. It does not include groceries, but would tax all services unless they're already exempt. And then LR22CA and LB408 would cap spending growth. So all of these components have been introduced with the exception of cutting the personal income tax rate. So we do expect to see some sort of tax reform bill that could appear into a shell bill, LB 431 or 432 or 433, or then something like LB 680, which is the corporate income tax. So we do think it's possible that we'll still see tax reform discussion yet this session. So that's something that we are keeping an eye on. The reason why we are concerned about it, because if we're cutting income taxes are the most progressive source of state revenue, whereas wealthy Nebraskans pay the most. Sales tax is the most regressive, so low income earners pay the most. So cutting income taxes and broadening the sales tax base will raise taxes on low and middle income families while cutting taxes for the wealthiest Nebraskans. And then our other concern is that if it's not revenue neutral, it would require budget cuts in the future. In the past, we have seen proposals similar to these. Again, we don't have the details yet, but a broad sales tax base broadening with the top income tax rate cut would have some distributional impacts that would look very similar to this, where again, the top 20% would see a cut and the bottom 80% would see some sort of increase. So the bottom line on tax reform is that the state depends on income tax revenue to fund schools, healthcare, corrections, and so on. This tax reform plan, once we see it, is likely to increase taxes on low and middle income families and could very well reduce revenue in the future, which would threaten funding for education, healthcare, everything that we saw on that very first pie chart, and limit the state's ability to fund new programs and services. It's likely to include spending restrictions for schools and local healthcare and other services low and middle income families rely on. Again, that would be the impact of LB 408 and LR22CA. And Black, Indigenous, people of color will likely be hit the hardest based on what we know about where BIPOC fit in in terms of low and middle income and the distribution of those taxes. All right, if there aren't any questions, I'm going to move on to the federal COVID relief package. So as you probably are aware, the House is going to be taking up a new federal COVID relief package this week. And then it will go to the Senate after that. They are shooting to have that passed by March 14th before the unemployment insurance benefits expire. So I'm going to go through some of the details of this COVID relief package. We have extended jobless benefits. It's going to be extended to August from the expiration. Right now it expires March 14th. This package would extend it to August. It would also increase the UI federal supplement from $300 to $400 a week. There are SNAP and PEBT benefits in here. It would extend SNAP to September, the increase to September, which is currently expiring in June, and that's a 15% increase in SNAP benefits. And then it would continue the PEBT through summer. In terms of housing emergency rental assistance, there was $19 billion in emergency rental assistance that would be in addition to the $25 billion supplement from December. In terms of healthcare coverage, there would be a reduction of premiums for those in the ACA marketplace, and it would expand benefits for higher income families and help them with their premiums as well. And for states that haven't passed Medicaid expansion, there's some additional incentive for them to do so. In terms of the child care tax credit and earned in EITC expansions, their child care tax credit would be extended to families with low or no earnings. It would raise the credit from $2,000 to $3,000 a year and add an additional $3,600 for children under 6 years old. And this would phase out at $112,500 for head of household, or $150,000 for families. In terms of the EITC, it would be extended to childless adults. Currently, their maximum benefit is $530. For childless adults, that would go to $1,500. And then it would also include 19 to 24-year-olds who aren't full-time students and those who are over the age of 65. TANF emergency fund. Let's see, there's $1 billion in additional funding for TANF. Minimum wage would be increased over time, I believe. I didn't write those details down about that. And the paid family emergency leave. There is aid to state and local governments. So the state of Nebraska would see additional funds for COVID relief, and our local governments would receive that as well. There is also education funding that would go to the Department of Education for K-12, and there's some higher ed funding as well. The K-12 funding does have a maintenance of effort and a maintenance of equity, which means that that education funding, that stimulus funds, cannot be used to replace state revenue unless the state was, so for example, in Hawaii, their state revenue is down 20%. So they're cutting everything 20%. So those K-12 funds could be used to replace state general fund dollars in that instance. In a state like Nebraska, where we're not making those reductions, it couldn't be used to replace state revenues. So we can't cut funding for K-12 education in our state budget and use this money to replace that funding. There is also a maintenance of equity, which means that if you are making cuts, you can't make more cuts to our low-income schools. So there is an equity impact there as well. So if anyone has any questions about that, but as I indicated, there will be more dialogue about this week as the House takes it up, and then it will go to the Senate. So that is the presentation, and I am happy to answer any questions.
I don't see any questions right now, but if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box. Oh, we have one. I'm not 100% sure what she's referring to. So if you do want to talk, Rachel, then go ahead and just raise your hand on the chat function and I will. But she said she doesn't know if she can answer this, but what would be the justification from those introducing these issues? Not on an individual level, but all together. The data is very clear. How is this a benefit to Nebraska? And I think she was talking about the COVID package. So I'm not too sure.
Rachel, can you clarify?
Yeah. Okay, Rachel.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, so I was just listening, and this is before the COVID discussion, but all of these different issues that are being raised. I mean, listening to the hearings, you can say, yes, we're reducing property taxes, or yes, we're doing this because, but all of these things are happening together. And as you demonstrated, that's going to put the pressure on middle and low income Nebraskans. What is the argument behind that? I mean, is there a reason of like, yes, but this is why we are doing that? What is kind of the perception of all of these things together? And again, you may not be able to answer that.
Yeah. And I assume that you mean with respect to like all the tax cut bills in particular.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah, so no, I think that's a fair question. You know, senators have been hearing for a long time about property taxes, and you know, senators, particularly in rural areas, when they get home, they get lobbied about their property taxes. And there's a couple of things I would say. One, no one's seen the benefit of the 1107 credit yet, right? So that was passed, and we're going to be paying on it this next fiscal year, but or next biennium. But senators are still hearing about their property taxes because they actually haven't seen 1107 come into play yet. So that's the clamoring for more property tax relief is still out there. The other thing about the 1107 credit, it's a refundable income tax paid against your education property taxes paid. So our concern is that senators are going to still hear about property taxes because property taxes actually aren't going to go down. People are going to get a refundable income tax credit. So their income taxes will go down, but they won't necessarily connect that to property taxes. So we think that that's an issue with the way that 1107 credit was structured. And then you have on the other tax cuts, you've got the chambers and others that are pushing for income tax cuts. And so it's this like constant drumbeat. It's interesting to hear the chamber talk about income tax cuts this year. And what we're hearing is that we need to cut our income taxes to keep our recruit 18 to 34-year-olds, which we know that 18 and 34-year-olds care about culture and inclusivity and diversity and all sorts of other things, but they're not paying that top income tax rate. So they're not particularly concerned about it. So I do think that there is this, you've got the chambers who are pushing for income tax cuts, and you've got the rural, the ag folks who are pushing for rural, who are pushing for property tax cuts. Again, they haven't seen 1107 take effect yet and haven't benefited from that yet. But it's all out there and it's a lot of noise, right, that folks are hearing. And we're still in this pandemic and people are hurting, even though there is a lot of money coming into the state. And our biggest concern is, we're not, our state budget, again, as we talked about, we have all this money coming in, but our budget is still relatively flat. And the 1107, the increase in the 1107 credit was really only supposed to take effect after we were funding our state budget growth at least 3.5%. But because of the change in the income tax filing deadline, that's sort of out the window. But I think it's really incumbent for the nonprofit community to be communicating with senators about what the needs are on the ground, because they're hearing a lot on property taxes and they're hearing some on income taxes. I mean, from certain groups on income taxes, I would say people are not, when senators knock on the door, they don't usually hear about income taxes. And polling we've done also would show that people are not very concerned about their income taxes, but it's a drumbeat. And so I think it's really important, Rachel, for us to be concerned. And we don't represent people. We do our data analysis, and so we don't we don't have that firsthand knowledge in terms of seeing what's happening on the ground and how people are really being impacted from the pandemic. And so I really encourage everyone on this call to make sure and I know folks are doing that, but just to make sure we know, senators know that there are these other needs out in the community. And our biggest concern is that if we're cutting income taxes and cutting property taxes, and especially doing it in a way where the impact is more in the future, right? We have to balance our budget, right? And so we're going to see these big increases in later years, and we're really concerned about, one, are we going to be able to afford them? Are we going to have to keep cutting the budget? Because again, 0.6% budget growth this year, and yet we're funding these increases in the property tax credit program. What happens when that credit goes up to $375 million? Are we just now going to be stuck in this flat appropriations growth for the foreseeable future? And I think it's incumbent on everyone on this call to communicate about what those needs are if we want to change it.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And falling into that, up to 34 range. My number one concern is schools. So let's stop defunding that. Anyway, right. That's my 2 cents. Thank you for answering the question.
Yeah. And we'll tell you in our polling too, the majority of Nebraskans, they'll say, oh yeah, cut my property taxes. And if you say, okay, are you willing to cut your property taxes at the expense of your public schools? And they say no. People in Nebraska really do love their public schools and are willing to pay more taxes actually to fund their public schools. So Rachel, you're not alone in that. And that is also a concern. We know that the chambers talk about public schools and how great they are in Nebraska as they're doing recruiting, because in a lot of states, public schools aren't as good as they are here. And we're afraid that we, either through this cap or through just reducing general fund appropriations, that we're going to really, cut our nose off to spite our face and end up with a public school system that's not as good, and that's going to hurt recruitment and retention of young folks, of new people, and of course our workforce long term.
Great. We have quite a few questions now, so that has spurred more questions. So thank you, Rachel. Will the new prison construction reduce operating expenses or raise them?
That's a great question. Presumably it would raise them, but I do not know. We haven't really dug into that. And again, I think there's a lot of discussion. There was an agreement, I think last week, to undertake a study to dig into this more. And so I think those are questions that are TBD.
Okay. How much discretion does the state have in applying COVID programs? They said that we don't have a good record of spending available Medicaid funding.
Spending available what funding?
So how much discretion does the state have in applying for these COVID programs for the money coming down? We don't have a good record with spending of Medicaid funding. Yes.
My understanding, the states actually have quite a bit of discretion in how those dollars are going to be used. I mean, I honestly don't know a lot about, I think the child care tax credit, a lot of those programs are just going to benefit families, much like there's an additional stimulus check. Those will go to families directly, right? Like the child care credit, that's going to be something you apply for on your income tax, earned income tax credit. I mean, that will just bypass the state altogether. I'm not exactly sure, and there may be folks on this call who know better than I do about how the housing will work. The funds for localities, like the funding for K-12, that'll go through the Department of Ed, and they'll have to apply for it through the Department of Ed. The funding for localities for cities and counties and villages and townships, they will have to apply for that directly to the federal government, so they won't go through the state for that either. The state money will need to be requested, and there's pretty broad use for those dollars.
To what extent are these dramatic declines in the state general fund related to 8 years of tax cuts?
Oh, yeah, very related. Yeah, so I think the last chart we saw from the Legislative Fiscal Office, they looked at tax cuts that have been passed since 2006, and that was reducing annual revenue by over 900 million. So we would contend that if we hadn't passed any of that, we could be spending that 900 million into education, right? And instead of us being second most reliant on property taxes, we would actually look a lot better, and we'd be in the top half of the country in terms of how we're funding K-12 education. So there's a direct relationship for sure.
I'm still learning a lot about this. Can you explain how lower income people actually pay more in sales taxes?
Yeah, good question. They pay more in sales taxes as a share of their own income. So I apologize for not being clear on that. So if you look, the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy does a really good report called Who Pays? And they have a distribution where they look at income taxes as a percent of their income and sales taxes as a percent of their income. So my apologies for glossing over that. But so it's not that they pay more, but they pay more as a percentage of their income in sales taxes and pay less as a percentage of they pay less in income taxes as a percentage, or getting myself all screwed up. They pay less in income taxes as a percent of their total income. And I don't have the chart in here, but what we see is that as a share of their income, sales, they pay about, low-income families pay about 11% of their income in sales taxes, for example, whereas the wealthier are paying, I think maybe about 4% of their income in sales taxes.
Another sales tax question. For years, there has been recommendations to expand the sales tax base. Why does this continually get shut down, specifically expanding to services, not food?
Yep, great question. What you hear from every lobby group that comes out and basically says, if you tax X, Y, and Z service, we'll be run out of business. This was something that if you think back to, for example, in Omaha, the restaurant tax that was passed under Mayor Settle, and that restaurants were going to go out of business, and we couldn't afford to do this, and we did it, and restaurants have not gone out of business because of the restaurant tax. So this is, you know, and it used to be when the sales tax passed in 1964, we were mostly a goods-based economy and not a service-based economy. So we taxed goods and we only taxed services that were added to the tax code. And it's just much harder, which is why Senator Breezy tried to tackle this challenge by saying, okay, we're just going to tax everything. And then you need to come back and make your case for why your particular service should be exempt. But really it's political.
Okay. Is there a significant FMAP increase that is factored into any budget considerations?
So the FMAP increase is factored into the preliminary budget. And as was stated earlier, it isn't directed necessarily at health programs, but does help just replace revenue that's not coming in and is sort of distributed among other general fund priorities.
Okay, we have one last question. It's kind of long, so if this person would like to ask it live, let me know. One of your first charts showed an alarming level of underinvestment from 1999 to projected, I would say 2023. How do we argue that the problems we're having in corrections and loss of healthcare services in rural areas, provider payment reductions, etc., and other issues are the result of underinvestment? Can OpenSky do a comparative look at underinvestment in other states to see where Nebraska stands?
That's a good question. You know, that probably could. I would have to give that some thought and talk with our analysts to think about how we do that. Yeah, and I think, was there a question? It was a very long question. Was there something about the cost of underinvestment in there?
Yeah, I think what is the, yep, let me go back to it. Yeah, what is the cost of underinvestment?
Yeah, so I think, you know, I don't know how you quantify that, but we've certainly seen that. For example, there were a few years ago, we had in our fall symposium, we had a panel of senators talk about how underinvestment had led to these crisis points. So if you remember a long time ago, Beatrice and the underfunding that had gone on at BSDC that created an utter crisis, and some folks I think died and from this underinvestment, and it ended up, we got fined by the federal government, and so we certainly it cost us more in the long run in terms of just how much we needed to put in to rectify the situation. And of course, people got hurt in the process. We saw this in child welfare. We're seeing it again, right? And corrections, I think you can make the same case. And so I do think, you know, unfortunately, we don't really notice it until it becomes a crisis mode, but there's definitely a cost, and we'd have to do some thinking about how you actually quantify that. But I think we have a lot of examples about how underfunding in particular programs end up costing us more in the long run.
Okay, that's all the questions we have. So thank you.
Perfectly on time.
Yeah. Thank you very much to OpenSky and to Renee for bringing these expertise to us. We're getting a lot of chat saying thank you. So you are very appreciative, and we look forward to doing one of these again soon. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Hannah.